Good evening, everyone, wherever you may be around the world. Welcome to the second day of our 12th ARC International Roundtable. This is Leo Martin Angelo R. Ocampo from the University of Santo Tomas, and I will be your moderator for tonight's discussions. Yesterday, we had a very rich and meaningful exchange about the impact of the pandemic on faith communities, in which we were blessed with perspectives from a variety of religions and locations around the globe. We once again express our gratitude to our speakers for generously sharing their insights and experiences. Tonight, what we have in store is something a little more Catholic in flavor, but no less exciting in terms of its scope, tackling the effects of the pandemic on faith communities, this time proceeding from different angles. At the same time, we are blessed tonight to hear the invaluable insights and experiences of our dear sisters. Now, we have women in our panel tonight. So, coming from our experiences last night, we would like to request our speakers if they could limit their presentation, please, to 20 minutes. And for our participants, kindly keep your questions brief and your comments to a minimum so we can hear more from our speakers and accommodate more questions. We hope also that you could all stay with us online until the end of tonight's roundtable and participate actively in our discussions. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is a professor and scientist from the College of Development Communication and director of the Learning Research Center of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. She is also an affiliate professor and chair of the Master of Development Communication program of UP Open University to talk about Sibahay from physical to virtual, flipping church services in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, uncertainty and implications to spirituality. May we now call on Benjamina Paula Gonzalez Flor of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Good evening,
Good
Professor.
evening. Good evening, everyone. Let me share my screen. So good evening, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good evening,
Hi.
everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Benji Flor, and my co-author is Joshua Michael G. Jonas. And our paper is titled Flipping Church Services in the Height of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Uncertainty and Implications to Spirituality. As we all experience, the COVID-19 pandemic brought many challenges to society that prompted the church to create social media ministries that flip its service. This is also the time where the role of the religious and spiritual interventions were heightened. Holding on to faith to end the pandemic was made possible by the presence of the Manila Cathedral in every home. Thus, the objective of this study is to find out attendance of the Catholic faithful to online daily mass in the Manila Cathedral through Facebook analytics, determine the trends of engagement that led to concept of Simbahay, and explain the implications of Simbahay as a flip service. Simbahay is a mnemonic which I will try to discuss shortly. So just give me, I'll just give you a bit of a context of, or the premises of the study. So the assumption is that 80% of the Filipino population are Roman Catholics. And the Holy Mass is the highest form of Catholic worship. The Manila Cathedral is considered as the mother of all churches. The non-stop brigade of prayers like the Oratio Imperata for protection against the COVID-19 pandemic. The special intentions are also said in the Holy Rosary that was prepared by Pope Francis which we do daily, that led us to have spiritual wellness. So spirituality is a coping skill, or maybe more of an adaptation, I would say, a switch off button to negative thinking, depression, and obsessive disorders. It was also achieving a sense of purpose or existence, a sense of connectedness to self, others, nature, and God, or a divine being, a search for harmony, hope, wholeness, or finding what completes you as a person, and a sense of transcendence, or the sense that there is more to life than we see. On the other hand, spiritual health possesses meaning and purpose in life, and having a clear set and media sources serve as contributing factors that an individual considers in what kind of prayer to invoke. Active and receptive prayer processes were contextualized by being done either privately or publicly, and were also affected by the quantity and quality of prayers and factors such as life crisis. The outcomes of prayers include physical healing, psychological health, and spiritual wellness. Thus, this paper attempted to explain the role, importance, and significance of the church and the celebration of religious activities during these trying times of the pandemic through the lens of the relational prayer theory. Prayer inputs, specifically media sources such as television, radio, and social media ministry, serve as channels of communication for Catholics to continue the practice of their faith through many virtual celebrations of the church. Flipping service online allowed Catholics to attend the Holy Mass regularly. Mirroring Basler's relational theory is the following conceptual framework, which we call Simbahay. Simbahay stands for salvation, indulgences, mission, blessedness or blessings, affordances, habitual, altruistic, and yes, we can. So we came up with this model of flip service. As you can see, this model tries to depict the relational theory of Basler. And simbahay is a fusion of two words, simbahan, which means a church, and bahay means a house. So literally, it means house, or literally the home as the church. So the variables, salvation refers to the desire of the worshiper to be spared from contracting the COVID-19 virus. Indulgence points to the desire of the faithful to be forgiven from their sins. Mission encapsulates that holding masses online can extend the church services to engage with the faithful, despite the absence of physical communion, and the rational to continuously provide spiritual nourishment. Blessings or blessedness are those that Catholics must be thankful for, from sheer waking up in the morning and receiving help from others and the government. Affordances point to what online Mass have made possible to worshippers. Habitual points to the transformation of flipping the home to become the church, regularly with most doing it on Sundays, holiday of obligation, or special church events that call for the participation of the Catholics. A for altruistic, which alludes to sacrifices that Catholics make to help others. And Y is for yes, we can. Establishes that as worshippers online, there is nothing impossible to a persistent heart. So simbahay, when practiced, can lead to outcomes such as physical, psychological, and spiritual that could strengthen the Catholic's faith to continuously pray regardless of mode, but with the guidance of the priest, like Father Kali and Father Reggie, the prayerful can be in a better position to be cleansed from sins for eternal salvation. Outcomes were not measured but can be implied based on the trends of number of live views in the online masses. Since only one schedule of the Mass was tracked, that is on Sunday at 8 o'clock in the morning, implications can be drawn to what extent simbahay was manifested in every worshipper or the faithful. In terms of methodology, we employed a secondary data analysis research design. Secondhand data analysis was based on Facebook analytics of the Manila Cathedral as subject of the study. Data on online mass attendance was based on the actual number of live views for daily masses and compared those on the average monthly attendance from March 2020 to March 2021. Data were tracked, encoded, and analyzed and interpreted as determinants of simbahay, which can be categorized into physical, psychological, and spiritual outcomes. Graphs were likewise created to explain the results and interpreted. The trend in attendance of worshippers served as grounding in interpreting the practice of flip service in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Data was validated by tracking the live streaming of a Sunday Holy Mass and determining which part of the Mass was most engaging, measured by the highest number of attendees. The results, so in terms of the trends of engagement in Facebook can also refer to the number of those actually seeing or attending the masses online. Looking at the monthly averages from March 2020 to March 2021, patterns seem to surface a fluctuating trend in accessing the online masses of the Manila Cathedral held in the mornings. Note that these figures only captured one daily mass schedule. It should not be it could be that the rest of the worshippers have attended other holy masses scheduled within the day. And these trends in engagement seem to allude to how worshippers have allocated their time for worship given the predicament that they are in. The huge number of attendees from 69,863 to more than 200,000 per month implies that flipping the home as church has gone a long way. In this graph, results imply that worshippers continue to attend masses regularly on Sundays, and the scheduled track was the 8 a.m. Mass at the Manila Cathedral. Not shown in this graph is the highest attendance in a daily Mass, which was during the reading of the Gospel that reaches more than 20,000 attendees at any one time. So the FB Analytics provided an anchor to explain the behavior of Catholics during the pandemic. Every practicing Catholic gave an outpour of prayers and intentions to spare themselves and the whole world from the devastating COVID-19 virus, praying more for salvation. People offer indulgences for the benefit of others during this period of trial. It has become a mission of everyone to help make the world a better place. People continue to pray for blessings for family, friends, relatives, and the rest of the world due to the lack of resources limited by lockdowns. The affordances that people get from hearing Mass from home by understanding the words of God better because they can focus to the readings and the sermon. Practices as Catholics during these trying times became habitual. It has become the normal way of life. To be altruistic is to have that unselfish concern for others. If some were to ask if people can thrive in this pandemic, the answer is yes, we can. The church is a vessel of healing in these most trying moments. So what are the implications of simbahay then as flip service? The flip service points to the new normal of worship. It only means that Catholics have resorted to online attendance to the Holy Mass because there is no other way of doing it as a form of response to crisis communication. Flipping the church led to the development of a new worship culture, which have changed how the Filipino Catholics have transformed the way the online masses were designed. The ability of the church to gather its flock through their social media ministry has successfully delivered and gathered God's followers to join as one church, albeit in their own homes. The mnemonic simbahay aptly explains why engagement is high. People ought to have a healthy mental health by feeding both psychological and spiritual needs. Through uplifting the church at home, it became the practice to attend online masses that strengthened religiosity. The use of social media to propagate attendance to online masses have created a sense of self-preservation and protection due to this intervention. Being prayerful and holding on to prayer somehow played a significant role in addressing anxieties and reducing uncertainty. In conclusion, these opportunities provided by technology paved the way for people to observe the different points of simbahay: salvation, indulgences, mission, blessedness or blessings, affordances, habitual, altruistic, and yes, we can. Simbahay posits that the church is not confined to the corners of the physical structure of worship, but the wholeness of people as members of the church and what has been done as followers of Christ even in the safety of one's own homes. Through Simbahay, prayers are fulfilled and answered, which eventually led to desired outcomes, be it physical, such as health, recovery, surplus of necessities, or psychological, such as happiness, sanity, calmness, or spiritual, such as divine providence and fulfillment. Finally, the pandemic may have become an obstacle to physically attending online masses, but it has also afforded an opportunity to reflect and renew oneself. It became a state of survival in these trying times, and with Simbahay, people will survive the pandemic or beyond. And yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez Flor. Professor Benji would also like to acknowledge her research collaborator present in our Zoom, Joshua Michael Jonas. So thank you very much. We shall proceed directly to our next presentation. Our next speaker is the Director of Ministerial Formation at St. John's University School of Theology and Seminary in Collegeville, Minnesota, USA. Her research explores the intersection of social communication, digital culture, and pastoral theology. She has served as consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Communications, as an educational consultant to the Catholic Press Association, and is an organizer for TheoCom, an annual conference on theology and communications held at Santa Clara University. Her major publications include Connected Toward Communion, The Church and Social Communication in the Digital Age, Evangelization and Catechesis, Echoing the Good News to the Documents of the Church, and Authority and Leadership, Values, Religion, Media. She has also published articles in Worship, Religious Education, New Theology Review, and has contributed chapters to a number of edited volumes. To share with us regarding her presentation, Entering the Mystery, Formative Strategies for Making Meaning Out of Digitally Mediated Worship During COVID-19, please help me welcome Professor Daniela Supan Jerome.
Good morning, everybody. Let me pull up my screen and I shall begin. Can you see the presentation slides? Okay. So again, I'm very happy to be here all the way from Minnesota. And I'd like to talk about mystagogy as a way to think about the COVID worship experience. So as you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has really necessitated for millions of Catholics around the world to experience participating in the liturgy through digitally mediated means. So during the height of the pandemic, many of us turned to YouTube or Facebook to live stream or a similar platform to view and witness and prayerfully participate in the liturgy while quarantined at home for safety and health concerns. Was this real worship? What does that mean theologically? Of course, this theological question requires a lot of considerable reflection, including thinking about the experience of worship as mediated by digital means and what that means. So that's one important question. But another important question, and the one I'd like to focus on, is how do we as communities of faith create formative spaces for such conversations in the first place, so that us as the community of the church can grow and unpack this experience and move forward from it. So how do we talk about what happened during COVID, and how can that be a formative experience for us? And this is what I'd like to talk about today. So for this, I'd like to propose the lens of mystagogy as a particular way to create a formative space to invite reflection and think more intentionally about digitally mediated worship. Using mystagogy, the presentation aims to propose this formational framework for people of faith to help make sense of our experience of digitally mediated worship during COVID. Engaging in a mystagogy of our experience is both spiritually formative and allows us to think about the presence of God throughout what happened. but also can be strategic and can help communities of faith strategize about their digital communication practices moving forward. So first of all, what is mystagogy? Really briefly, this term mystagogy comes from the Greek, and it's a combination of mystis, agein, which refers to the idea of leading or conducting forward a person who has been initiated. The term is pre-Christian and had carried cultic and secular connotations. In its cultic sense, it referred to bringing an initiated person more deeply into the philosophy and to the practices of a mystery cult, such as those that were prominent in Greco-Roman antiquity, especially the first 3 centuries. The mystery cults had a deep experiential component, taking part of rituals or activities that provided the core formative opportunity for the person who took part in those. Hold on, I jumped ahead. In the Christian context, this term, the way the church began to use it, emerged around the 4th century and beyond. And we have evidence through the catechetical homilies of people like Cyril of Jerusalem, Ambrose, John Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuestia, these bishops who we have inherited their preaching to catechesis, catechetical context. And they use the term especially in the context then of Christian initiation, and to invite those who were newly baptized to enter more deeply into the experience of faith. And their homilies were looking back to look forward. In other words, they, through the lens of faith, they recall what has happened to those who were just baptized, and then help them open up the mysteries of faith for further growth and reflection to the neophyte. So mystagogical catechesis was really unpacking the experience to guide the believer into deeper relationship with God and the community. And in the contemporary rites of Christian initiation for adults, we see this approach renewed and practiced today. Also in our contemporary era, mystagogy in the theological way found a broader meaning, namely as a way to think about the intersection of faith and life experiences. Karl Rahner, for example, proposed mystagogy as a lens to help think about how the human experience connects with the mystery of God, especially through grace. And how does that guide one more deeply into the church? So a broader way that he used that term. Other contemporary approaches include, of course, religious experience as an overall mystagogical process, an invitation to reflect on life and grace in an ongoing, lifelong sense. In the most recent Christian and post-Christian and secular context, mystagogy has also emerged as a relevant way to think about religious experience as a whole, though not necessarily as a way to initiate people into a community at the same time, but really more like deep meaning making. And this is the work, for example, of Bert Robin and Schambeck out of Germany. So sufficient to say that through this evolution, mystagogy has carried with it a number of key elements which are helpful for us to think further about. So regardless of where it was along the timeline, mystagogy has tended to involve invitation and initiation, the importance of experience, the importance of guidance and accompaniment of others to help expose the mystery or guide and join participants through the religious experience. Mystagogy also involves deep meaning making based on that experience and guiding people toward a deeper commitment to community, ongoing growth and deeper engagement with those around them, a deeper sense of mission, a deeper sense of religious identity, and a deeper sense of commitment in relationship to the divine. I have a couple of reasons why I'd like to propose that mystagogy is a helpful lens for us to think about the COVID experience. To me, this is a salient term for thinking about what happened during COVID, because at the heart of the COVID experience that we're talking about is worship experienced as a sacramental action, albeit through these digitally mediated means. So it was an experience of a sacred mystery, even though it's through our screens. So how do we think about that? For me, these are the convergence points. Number one, both mystagogy and the COVID experience start with these deep experiential foundations. So as I say, mystagogy invites a participant into a deeper understanding of a particular experience. So rather than thinking about theory first, mystagogy starts with experience in a way that leads into deeper meaning making and deeper engagement with the community or the context of the experience. So also, when it comes to digitally mediated worship during COVID, the experiential foundations of living through the pandemic are undeniable. This may be the same with your experience, but whenever I saw or connected with people during that time, they were always telling their COVID stories, what was happening in their household, how they did Sunday Mass with the screens. So it starts with thinking about the experience, telling the story of it. So as a whole, reflecting about digitally mediated worship during COVID is by and large revisiting an experience and thinking about what happened during that time through various lenses. So to me, that's the first connection point. Second, it's not just experience, it's a religious experience. So as I was saying, mystagogy has pre-Christian, pre-cultic origins, but as we appropriated the term in the Christian tradition, we talk about it particularly as a way to think about religious experience in particular, and sacred action in the context of the liturgy, most particularly. When it comes to mystagogy in the ecclesial sense, there are two constitutive elements to it. There's the sacred action itself, the celebration of the sacrament, and then the reflection and explanation that takes place around it. Both of these are mystagogical. And so both the experience of liturgical action and the explanation of instruction can communicate mystery. So during our COVID pandemic, many of our, as you know, digitally daily interactions were mediated all of a sudden, whether it was entertainment, shopping, education, socializing, but also it came to be that we found our religious experiences by and large mediated through these screens. So worship became this unique experience. And so mystagogy gives us a sense, a way to think about sacred action through experience through this context. The third convergence is that mystagogy and the COVID experience both involved an element of mystery. Invitation into mystery is elemental to mystagogical thinking. This means that the full meaning of the sacred action cannot be exhausted, and that explanation in structure or conversation about the experience of sacred action is not meant to provide neat and ready answers or solutions. Instead, mystagogy proposes reflection around the experience of sacred action in such a way to open up conversation space that leads participants into embracing ambiguity and growth toward deeper meaning making, all the while continuing to engage in the experience of sacred action. Mystagogical meaning making is dynamic. It's oriented toward metanoia and growth, a deepening of relationship with God and with community. It's lifelong and doesn't get completed or solved. In mystagogy, there's always a new element of mystery to explore, a new facet of convergence of life and faith. So when it comes to worship during COVID, many of the elements of this kind of particular religious experience were likewise ambiguous and led to a recognition of questions and of divine mystery without a necessary neat and ready solution. In a way, we're still thinking about those questions. So, for example, how is it that God is really present in this sacred action, both on the altar, but also in my living room? How is it that God's mediated presence is different in terms of the sacramental action from my home during this time of worship? Or what does it mean that God is present in my home at all during this time of worship? How can that be? What does that mean for my home life? Or a tougher question, if God is present in my home during this time of worship, why worship at a church after a pandemic? So these are all complex questions to think through. And none of them have neat, clear-cut, easy, quick answers, but rather they create theological conversation spaces that can deepen one's understanding and one's commitment and life of faith. They're all invitations into mystery. And a mystagogical approach has a good potential for holding these formative conversations. Finally, my last convergence is to draw toward community. Mystagogy, specifically in the Christian context, is an ecclesial process. It's a process of the church's response to searching for deeper meaning in the sacred action. Mystagogy also shifts the gaze from looking within oneself to looking out, to look toward mission, to look toward community, to look to others. The meaning making is communal all the way through. The sacred action itself is celebrated in community, and the subsequent content of instruction or explanation also emerges from the wisdom of the community in the tradition. Likewise, the aim of mystagogy is also communal. It's to facilitate the believer's path toward communion, both with God, but also with the life of the community, the ecclesial body of Christ. Although inclusive of individual reflection, the mystagogical process is held in communion. When it comes to the experience of worship during COVID, perhaps I think the most fundamental question was that of communion as well. We were isolated and physically separated from the sacred action, and so our communities of faith grappled with how to sustain a sense of community and communion through this challenging time. And mystagogy, I think, is a salient concept to anchor this connection toward communion during a time of physical separation. So moving forward, what might a mystagogical model for conversation look like? And so this is really a brief overview. Here on the left side, you see a couple of bullet points. I draw these from Thomas Morris's book on the Christian rite of initiation, what he proposes in there as elements to include in a mystagogical process in the context of catechesis and baptism and initiation. So for those who are newly baptized, these are some things that mystagogy might include for those, without COVID. Meditating on scripture, gathering to discuss the experience, personal prayer and reflection, sharing in the Eucharist, going to engage in liturgical planning, perhaps, offering public witness on a new life of faith, engaging in fellowship and mission. So as I say, for someone who's newly baptized, these might be ways to think about how to do mystagogy with them in that particular way of church. So I took this as a model, and I began to think about what might be a way to help the church reflect on the COVID experience using some of these same elements. So like I say, these are for initiation process, but they can be a way to give us a broader pedagogy. So I was saying along these lines, these might be some of the elements we could use to engage in mystagogy about what happened during COVID on the left side. So to me, these fall into three categories, and they are more broadly story, reflection, and mission. And I match the colors of the elements to where I see a story element, reflection element, or mission element. So I say if we were to do mystagogy, it should include these elements. It should include an element of giving a conversation space for recalling the experience, for telling the story of what happened. I think this would be initial starting point. There would be also a reflection component, especially seeing the experience in light of the word, or performing sort of a Lexio type reflection, where we see our story in light of the greater Christian story. And then there ought to be also an element of mission, of looking outward to how we can offer wisdom or feedback or contribute to a sense of mission of the church. And these might be offering witness of our experience or COVID story, offering feedback or to help plan mediated worship online presence, even for a community of faith based on what we've experienced. Or even further, engaging in outreach of those who are shut in, thinking about our own shut-in experience and see how now we could be of service of those who still continue to be shut in. So as I say, story, reflection, and mission, to me, give me a broad pedagogical framework for doing mystagogy, having a post-COVID conversation. Really briefly, I wanted to show you these pictures. This is my experience of COVID liturgy. These were my children in my living room. During that time, we have our mass set up here on the iPad, and then this is what it looked like with my children. So just the opportunity to think about these experiences in our households, a space for conversation, for telling that story and what that was like, a space for reflection, seeing this experience not just as the messiness and the craziness of this household, but really an opportunity for the tradition, the word of God speaking to this experience, to engage in a sense of lexio of the experience. How is Christ present in the midst of this home with these children, with this family? How can the word and tradition break that open? And then a sense of mission. How can this experience inspire this household, these Christians of faith, to make the community's experience better, richer, more toward serving others? We can unpack that with question. So to close, of course, there's questions that arise from this, questions to develop. I came up with a couple of them, and then I'll look forward to more comments as time allows. But one question, for example, is what would be the proper context for doing Mistagogy as a community of faith? Would it be something that the whole community does? Would it be something that the church staff does as like a retreat? Would it be something we invite people to do occasionally, once in a while, as part of catechesis? Like, how would we actually do this? What would be the proper context of hosting a conversation like this? I haven't thought that through, and I'd love your feedback on that if you have thoughts on that. Another question is, the way I describe this process, it's really for those at this point who have actually hung on, if you will, during COVID by means of digitally mediated worship. So it's for the people who live streamed, who watched every week and in their living rooms prayed along. And so it's a conversation space for people who've had that experience. But what about those other members of the community who were not that committed, who maybe worship once in a while through digital media, or are just seekers or have become disengaged? This conversation, does it allow them to be part of it too? And how can we draw them into a mystagogical process? And finally, can there be some sort of convergence between mission and people thinking through this experience? So for example, those who have the opportunity to think mystagogically about how they worship during COVID, can that be not just a thought exercise or a faith formation exercise, but a way really for the church to begin to think strategically and toward mission, to how to extend their outreach towards seekers, toward those who are occasional members, those who have not returned? So can this be a formal avenue for people to lead toward a missional next step? So those are three questions I thought about. I'd love to hear from you more in the context of conversation. And for now, thank you for your time and attentiveness.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniela, for your wonderful presentation. I'm so amused by your kids and all those playmas things. I never imagined using those, but I think having an imaginative mom like you made it a privileged experience for you.
Recording in progress.
So that's just so cute. Anyway, I think we have questions coming in. Father Anthony.
Yes, we do. So I would like to first, we have a question for Dr. Benjamina from Father Norman. The question is there a way for measuring the variable of participation at Mass during COVID? Only attendance online or living the significance of the Mass at home? Would you like to address that, Dr. Benjamina or Joshua?
Yeah, we will both address it. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, Father Norman, for your question. So, with regards to measuring the variable of participation of the Holy Mass during this time of pandemic, from our perspective as development communicators, the answer for measuring participation in the context po in the context of Facebook analytics would be measuring the shares, the likes, the comments. Any Facebook administrator who streams this Facebook live events has these data in the Facebook administrator's account, which they can analyze after these live events occur. So, to answer that question, to measure the participation would be to measure the responses and reactions of the faithful during this Facebook Live. We're talking about the Facebook Live because in other media sources, for example, in television, if the online mass is streamed through television, the participation would be a bit difficult to measure because there would be no way for the streamer to monitor the participation of those attending. So our response would be in the context of the Facebook Live. However, this would be limited in Facebook because the participation is passive unless the administrator would tune in to the real-time comments, responses, or reactions during the online mass. So some closely knitted parishes, communities, or circle of friends rather, opt to celebrate the online mass through video conferencing applications such as Zoom, Google Meet. So this avenue would be a bit easier to participate or partake in the celebration of the Holy Mass because one could easily respond to the prayers of the priest, and the priest himself would hear and see the faithful. So, Ma'am Bench, would you like to add something to that?
I think there's a second question to that. It's the significance of the Mass at home. I would
Yes.
say this is something personal. So doing a qualitative study using a phenomenology would perhaps be explored to explain the reason behind the action.
Okay.
That's
Thank you, Father.
Okay, thank you very much. We now would like to ask Dr. Daniela a question. We have a question from Aaron in Brunei. The question for Dr. Daniela is, in the context of Mr. Goji, does the perception of experience or personal or communal affect, especially if it is traumatic, worship and relationship with God?
Are you asking in particular traumatic? That's interesting. I see it. I think that sacred action and reflection upon it has broad hospitality. And I think that if we were to come and tell our stories of COVID, I think a lot of it is to more or less degree traumatic because it involves a pandemic and suffering and separation and illness. I think God's grace has space for that. So certainly as we would reflect on our COVID experiences of worship, it would certainly have to make room for suffering and pain and trauma as a true element of what happened. I'm recalling even the language of the Psalms, some of the lamentation Psalms would especially speak to the brokenness that people might have felt during this time. So I think that's how I would begin to address that certainly it would be a conversation that makes room. So it doesn't make it neat and pretty, like, look how cute my children are setting up their toys during Mass, but rather, like, let's talk about how it was to be separated from our families, to really grapple with illness, to worry about others, to experience the fear and the loss of it too. So I would hope that there would be language and space for that in any sort of experience that kind of does a mystagogy of what happened. Does that address the question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniela. I think if Aaron, if you have any more questions for Daniela, you can address it in the chat. I would just like to go back now to Dr. Benjamina with another question, and then if we have time, we'll go back to Daniela again. The second question for Dr. Benjamina and Joshua is, how do we account Simbahay in the midst of the existing digital divide in our society?
Yeah, I'll go first, Josh.
Sure,
Yeah,
ma'am.
in the Philippines has the highest penetration in terms of Facebook use. Even a barker or a lotto dealer is present online. So there is a high possibility that they would spend some time and some data if they really want to hear Mass. Perhaps the digital divide may be in terms of the type of phone, the type of phone that they use, but I guess everyone is online these days. And if they're not able to attend masses through social media ministry of the church, we also have radio and television. So if they really want to attend, I don't think that would be necessary if they have to go to Facebook only.
Thank you very much. We have two questions, short questions, one from Father Norman in the Philippines and one from Sheehan in Australia. I'll combine them together for Daniela. The question is, how can we contextualize Mr. Golgi in contemporary life of ordinary Christian? And the second part from Sheehan is, how can we bring this to the life of the ordinary, I think the ordinary people? So maybe you can address both of that together.
Yeah, I think that's very good questions. And it's something I also continue to think about, because as I composed the presentation, I realized this would be for those who are most committed and those who come and they're committed to the church and they hung in through COVID. So how can we make this experience broader? And I really think that one way to do it is through the witness of those people in the pew, the committed participants of the community, to then they extend their experience to those who are maybe more on the margins. I think if this is something coming more from the hierarchy, then it might be more at a distance for those who are less committed, but rather really giving people who are committed members of the community a language and first of all, a thought process, a reflection process, but then a language and a mission to share what they went through and talk to their neighbor and talk to their colleague and they talk to their family members, in an equal term away. And share what it was like for them to still worship God through this way. So I would really want to empower the committed participants to reach out to those who are less committed, who are just ordinary, regular people who are maybe at the margins of the community. I have to think more about the actual process of how to do that and how is it a retreat opportunity? Is it faith formation, or how to actually have people do this? I have to think more on that. I think maybe communities of faith have to think more on that, how to create spaces for the conversation. But I would really empower those who are so committed to reach out to those who are less committed as a start.
Thank you very much. Back to Leo.
Thank you very much, Father, and thank you also to our first presenters. Again, a virtual round of applause to Dr. Benji, to Joshua, and also to Dr. Daniela. So thank you very
Sir
much.
Leo, if I may po,
Yes.
I would like to add something po regarding to the question regarding the digital divide, because I think it's a very good question, since true enough, not everyone has access to these online media sources. But regarding our concept of simbahay, we have to look into the premises of the relational prayer theory. So our paper considers the media sources as the prayer input. So Baser includes other inputs as well, such as the social demographic variables and religious or spiritual relationships. So we look only into the media sources aspect, since it is the input very much apt to our situation today, because only recently, since our church just opened. But before, during the heightened restrictions, the faithful are compelled to attend Holy Mass only through media, which is TV, television, radio, or social media due to community quarantine restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for that rejoinder. It's a very important thing also to look into, how are we catering, as Dr. Daniela said, to those on the fringes, to those who are unable to participate now that everything is online, and especially during the lockdowns. All right, so now we proceed to our next set of speakers. Our next speaker gave us a very short introduction. He's a budding scholar who teaches religion at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, where he is also currently taking up doctoral studies in theology. To talk to us about the communicative role of chameleon chaplains in their pastoral ministry during the COVID-19 pandemic, please help me welcome Mr. Vince Henry M. Salias.
Good evening to everyone. Let me share my screen first. Am I audible and am I visible? Okay, thank you. So yeah, good evening from the Philippines. I am Vince Henry M. Salles, and I am here to present my study entitled The Communicative Role of Chameleon Chaplains in Their Pastoral Ministry During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So as a backgrounder, as of November 4, 2021, there have already been more than 248 million COVID-19 cases worldwide, which resulted in more than 5.02 million casualties. And behind these statistics are real people who were really greatly affected by the pandemic. And the pandemic uh, not only affects the physical health of people, but also their psychological, their social, and their spiritual dimensions. Sickness, as we know, disrupts our equilibrium. And in order to achieve overall wellness, the spiritual aspect of a person must also be considered as well. Spirituality is essential in an individual's meaning and identity. And loss of this will impact immediately and substantially a person's well-being. Enabling the spiritual aspect of a patient's well-being should be considered side by side treatment and interventions necessary to address their health problems. And it is the role of hospital chaplains to meet the spiritual needs of patients and healthcare workers. The landscape of for hospital chaplaincy has changed so much due to the health risks brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it has impacted how hospital chaplains communicate and provide pastoral care to the patients, to their families, and to the medical staff. My study will describe the communicative role of hospital chaplains belonging to the Order of the Ministers of the Infirm, or also known as the chameleons, before the pandemic struck, and how the pandemic altered their communication strategies that they employ in dealing with the hospital stakeholders. I conducted in-depth interviews with 4 chameleon priests serving as chaplains of hospitals and healthcare institutions taking care of COVID-19 patients. And this case study involved inquiry conducted virtually through Zoom. My initial plan for this study was complete enumeration for data. Hence, I asked for the list of all chameleon hospital chaplains in the Philippines ministering to COVID-19 patients. However, out of the 6 hospital chaplains identified, only 4 agreed to be interviewed. Although this study's sample size is quite small, the information gathered, I think, was adequate to provide rich narratives of chaplain work during the COVID-19 pandemic. The 4 chaplains were contacted and they were sent a message through the internet explaining the rationale of the study and the interview questions. And the research participants were informed that their identities would be protected with aliases. I transcribed the interviews, the recordings, and translated them to English. The transcriptions of the 4 interviews were presented in narrative form, which is descriptive and detailed. The 4 respondents for the interview are all priests. They belong to the Order of the Ministers of the Infirm, or the chameleons. I gave them the aliases Father Matthew, Father Mark, Father Luke, and Father John. Father Matthew belongs or is a chaplain in a public hospital here in the Philippines. Also Father Mark. Father Luke, on the other hand, is a chaplain in a public healthcare facility. And Father John, a chaplain in a private hospital. So before continuing with the study, I would like to give an overview of who the chameleons or who the ministers of the infirm are. So the thought of forming a congregation to minister to the sick occurred to Saint Camillus de Lelis after observing the poor conditions of hospitals in Rome and the poor treatment of sick people. In the year 1584, Camillus founded his congregation to relieve the ever-present merciful love of Christ for the sick and to bear witness to it to the world. The congregation was approved and confirmed by Pope Sixtus V in 1586, allowing Camillus and his companions to live together in poverty, chastity, and obedience, and in the service of the sick and the plague stricken. It's noteworthy to note that Camillus also lived in a time of a plague, or what we call now as a pandemic, although theirs was just an epidemic because it was localized. Aside from their three usual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the chameleons, the religious men and women of the ministers of the infirm, take a fourth vow, wherein they consecrate themselves to the service of the ill, even at the risk of their own life. And the presence of the chameleons here in the Philippines began in 1974 and was formally established in 2003. They live out their charism through hospital chaplaincy, administration of healthcare institutions, parish ministry, community-based healthcare, public health services, and seminary formation. And during this COVID-19 pandemic, the ministers of the infirm have been very active in their work for the sick. Although there were modifications to their usual ministry, they adapted and thought of creative ways to still pastorally serve the sick. And chameleon priests assigned as hospital chaplains still continued their apostolates despite the risks posed by the pandemic. So for the discussion part, Father Matthew summed up the duty of a chaplain into two. For him, a chaplain is a minister of healing and hope. According to him, minister of healing refers to listening to the voices of the suffering patients. He acknowledged that listening is not an easy job because you have to sit with the patients for hours. Father Matthew defined minister of hope as not giving false hope, but rather bringing Christ to the sick in their lives. It's also making the patients appreciate God's hand at work so that they will have hope, even though their sickness is irreversible. It is making the patients hope for God's forgiveness of their sins. Meanwhile, for Father Mark, a chaplain is a representative of the church, a spiritual minister to safeguard the faith and to give the sacraments of the church to the people. He also mentioned about his role in providing spiritual formation to the hospital employees. Thirdly, for Father Luke, the primary task of a hospital chaplain is a spiritual accompanier for the sick and those who are taking care of the sick. He looks after the psycho-emotional needs of the hospital employees as well. And finally, for Father John, he shared that a hospital chaplain's regular duty is administering the sacraments, particularly the Holy Eucharist, anointing of the sick, and reconciliation. Hospital chaplains do not only take care of the sick, the patients, they also take care of the family members of the sick and the healthcare workers. So we can say that hospital chaplains have a lot on their plate. So let us now look how the pandemic affected the priest chaplains' ministries for the sick. As enumerated earlier, a chaplain's duties and responsibilities are very personable. They involve very personable acts, an encounter between peoples in which the patient's spiritual and emotional needs are met. Face-to-face presence and communication are essential in the pastoral care of the sick, and it engages both the chaplain and the patients in a meaningful and deeply human level. However, due to the restrictions necessarily imposed by the government authorities to contain the virus, pastoral ministry seemingly became depersonalized. So the question of one author named Daniel Nuzum may also be the question of many hospital chaplains now, struggling to provide spiritual comfort to COVID-19 patients. The question is, how do we remain pastorally close while physically distant from the patients? So although some of the chaplains that I interviewed were allowed to minister in person to COVID-19 patients, they had to wear what we call PPE, or personal protective equipment, so they can go near to the sick people. One chaplain that I interviewed commented that wearing PPEs, or personal protective equipment, is uncomfortable, but he knows that it's necessary to protect the patients and himself. In the ongoing onslaught of the pandemic, the work of hospital chaplains has increased in difficulty. They became like shock absorbers of the workers, the hospital workers, the patients, and their family members. And how chaplains handle the stresses of their job deserves another study. I'm now going to present the creative ways that the chaplains used to still connect with the sick people despite their distance. Firstly, the chaplains celebrate Mass wearing their personal protective equipment in a healthcare facility's lobby. And the Mass is usually attended by the frontliners, the health workers who are off duty. The Mass is being amplified using the hospital's sound system, composed of microphones and speakers placed in front of the building lobby, so that the patients inside the wards can hear the Mass at least. And during his homily, one chaplain that I interviewed, Father Luke, inserts encouraging messages for the patients and the healthcare personnel. The chaplains depend on the sound system to communicate with the patients inside the wards. They ask the patients to clap loudly or to shout, no, to tell if they are feeling okay, or if they already want to go home to their families. When the patients hear the voice of the priest, the chaplain, they immediately respond. The shouts and the applause of the patients are already enough feedback for the chaplains. Next, the chaplains also conduct, a kind of mini procession of the Blessed Sacrament inside the wards or along the corridors of the uh, facility after their Mass. The chaplains share that they witnessed up close the faith of these patients and the nurses who were intently praying while the Blessed Sacrament was passing by. The chaplain disclosed that he was so moved and inspired to see the people who expressed their desire for healing. Another is an online counseling for COVID-19 patients, persons suspected of having the virus, and the frontliners. These people usually tell the chaplain of the discrimination that they experience from their neighbors, from others. The people feel anxious and afraid because their community members tell them to leave their area. So these one-on-one counseling with the chaplains are conducted using video conferencing tools like Zoom or Facebook Messenger. The chaplains encourage them to continue their frontline job in battling COVID-19, even though it is exhausting. Next is a mental health awareness program organized by the chaplains, intended for the healthcare workers to release their tensions, similar to a stress debriefing, to ensure their mental well-being. Some of the participants were previously infected by COVID-19 but were able to recover. The program became an avenue for the participants to share their intense feelings during the lockdown, especially when they discovered that they were infected with the virus. They gave very powerful testimonies on how clinging to God and having faith in Him helped them get through their intense fears of dying or themselves and their loved ones being sick. Almost all of them shared that their faith gave them hope. And because of their faith, they were able to feel the love of God and their families. One of the chaplains that I interviewed shared a rather extraordinary experience of ministering directly to COVID-19 patients in person. He was given a chance to minister to COVID patients 5 times to anoint them with oil at their family's request, and he obliged. He readily obliged. He recounted the procedure he followed in administering the sacrament of anointing. He prepared the holy oils in advance, as you can see here in the picture, and transferred them in sachet packs. Because if one enters a COVID ward, whatever is brought inside should be left there. So before going inside the COVID ward, Father Mark, his alias, wore a PPE, personal protective equipment, 2 layers of gloves, and goggles. He approached the the patients who were already intubated and recited the invocations from memory. He did not bring a prayer book because the prayer book, according to Father Mark, might be contaminated. So the patients were conscious and were aware of the chaplain's presence when he came. He said that one patient even opened his eyes, and the oil inside the sachet was dropped on the patient's forehead and the hands. After anointing, he threw away the sachet in a bin inside the ward since it's already contaminated. All the five who were anointed died afterwards because they were already severely infected. So hospital chaplains, aside from being with the patients in their sickness, also engage in an end-of-life care. And as Morris puts it, chaplains dwell in the midst of death and dying. Chaplains walk with the wounded. This is perhaps one of the hardest things to do in life of a hospital chaplain. One chaplain shared that he was able to bless the remains of a person who died due to COVID-19. The remains of the person were already in a black body bag, and he blessed it at the corridor after being discharged from the morgue. The chaplains were able to celebrate a mass for the dead in order to accompany the grieving family. So in practical considerations and recommendations by the World Health Organization for religious leaders and faith-based communities in the context of the COVID-19, they acknowledge the role of religious leaders as major and primary in saving lives, reducing illness and being a source of support, comfort, guidance, and direct health care and social service for the people they minister to. So as a recommendation for this study, priests, chaplains who are willing and healthy and have followed health protocols must be allowed inside COVID-19 wards to anoint, or if they can, to hear confessions of the sick and the dying, or just be with the patients who suffer from isolation. And if in-person ministry is impossible, government authorities, after referring to this study, could provide ways for hospital chaplains to reach out to the sick even virtually. For example, by connecting them to private and public hospitals or giving them communication technologies. This study may also be used as a model for other hospital chaplains serving COVID-19 patients, their families, and the hospital staff. The narratives are good examples of communicative techniques and dispositions that may be used in ministry. And it is recommended that this study be replicated among other religious congregations focused on the well-being of the sick or among the diocesan clergy who are assigned as hospital chaplains. So thank you very much for listening and have a good night.
Thank you very much, Professor Salies. We now move on to our next presenter. Our next speaker holds a PhD in communication, MBA, and journalist. She has over 20 years of experience serving over 50 clients in the public, private, and academic sectors in 18 countries. She represents Latin America at Sydney's Global Digital Desk and has acted as facilitator at the Faith Communication in the Digital World conference led by the Vatican Dicastery of Communications. Currently, she serves as Director of Strategic Communication at the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador. She is the author of the book Desempeño y versus Impacto, un modelo comunicacional aplicado a la política digital, social media, citizenship, and politics. From Ecuador to present on empathy, the key to handle digital communications post-pandemic, please help me welcome Professor Albertina Navas.
Thank you. Can you see my PPT? Yes? Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm actually honored to have this time to share with you some thoughts that I've written in the form of an essay on behalf of the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador. I'm going to address this this talk on four main points. I'm going to start with the four digital communications phenomena during the pandemic. I'm going to give a brief frame.
Dr. Albertina, we can only see a white screen. We cannot see your PowerPoint yet.
Okay. I'm sorry. Let me try again. Now?
Yes, you're okay now. We can see now.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, so I'm focusing, as I was mentioning, on four key points. The first one is the four digital communications phenomena that I've identified during the pandemic. The second one is a brief framing about Jesus Christ as the great communicator. Then I'm going to talk a bit about empathy and how is it the key to handle post-pandemic digital communications, especially focused on social media. And then I'm going to share with you some thoughts about conclusions and recommendations. Well, when I talk about the communications environment during the pandemic, I could identify four phenomena during the peak of the pandemic. The first one is called infodemia. This name was coined by the World Health Organization, and it has to do with the overload of information which overcomes our capacity of managing it. You may say, but it's the same as infoxication. That is a phenomenon that we have already studied during the late 90s. The difference between infodemia and infoxication is that infodemia also implies the lack of capacity to identify valuable data and reliable sources rather than the ones that are not. A second phenomenon is called a hypersensitivity. It refers to the management of narratives in the intent of manipulations. It's some sort of polarization in which we talk about heroes and villains, the good and the evil, the conscious and the unconscious. If you remind when we were during the peak of the pandemics, the heroes were, of course, the doctors, the scientists, firemen, and the bad people were the ones who had to leave their homes to work, for example. And people referred to them as the people who were not respecting their own lives and other people's life. So it became a very polarized narrative. The third phenomenon we can talk about is the atypical cycles. It refers to the behavioral changes in the digital environment. For example, in 2020, social media presented 5 times more posting density than the usual. For example, in 2019, Twitter had an average of 500 million tweets a day. During the peak of the pandemic, it came up to 700 million tweets a day. Also, Google searches increased 100 times, and 60% of those Google searches were related to COVID and COVID-related keywords. And finally, we can talk about a fourth phenomenon, which is disinformation. This is what people usually call fake news. When we study this disinformation disorders, we try not to use this term fake news because it's not as simple as false information. It is called what we say information pathologies. Why? Because it may be true information in a false context. It may be false information in a true context, or even true information without context. So the point is that these information disorders may lead to invalid conclusions. It may start with misinformation, which may be false information, but believing that it's true. Malinformation is based on reality, but with the intent of causing harm. But disinformation is this dissemination of false information with the intent of harming somebody else's reputation, of an institution reputation. This is why this communicational environment is so complex. In this framing, since I'm not an expert on religion, I'm just going to go very briefly through this framing about communication that Jesus is the great message. From the paradigm, Jesus offers a paradigm of communication practice when he refers to himself as the way, the truth, and the life. From the example perspective, we may say that Jesus demonstrated that he was a communicator through his missionary approaches, specializing in custom-made communication. And the cross message is Jesus is presenting all communications that seeks to carry his word to serve others. In this framework, I'm going to refer to what empathy is. I have some different definitions from different authors. I'm going to cite just a few. Melody Wilden say that empathy is the ability to detect others' emotions and understand their perspective. While Professor Brené Brown say it's feeling with the person, it's climbing down the hole to sit beside him, making yourself vulnerable to sincerely connect with them. If we take a Simon Sinek perspective, we may say that empathy is understanding the other people's feelings by putting yourself in their shoes and taking their perspective. I would like you to see now my slide on the screen. If I asked you who this character is, you may say it's Sadness, the popular character of the film Inside Out. And this blue little character is called Sadness. I would say that that character was myself in the year 2017. And let me share with you, and let me make the long story short. On the year 2015, I decided to move from my hometown in Ecuador to Central America in Guatemala for 5 years. 6 months after I moved, my father died. 3 months after he died, my aunt, my beloved aunt with whom I was raised with, died as well. And 1 year after my aunt died, my brother died unexpectedly as well. So in the period of 1 year and a half, I three key people of my inner circle. And since I am a very active social media user, that sadness was reflected on my social media profiles. Understand the situation. I really don't know what to say, but please let me know if I can be helpful somehow. And that is really, really important in that point of time. So since I left that myself, I started to think, how could we be empathic in a digital environment? And I want to share with you 7 signs of empathic people in social media environments. The first one is to be fully present with others. And that implies to publish and to share content with a user perspective. Because sometimes in social media, we think about our own selves only, or our own institutional goals or objectives. And we actually miss the point of talking from the nature of each social media network, from each DNA, and understanding the environment. And being that said, for example, Facebook, it's supposed to be some sort of personal environment where I may share what I love to do, what I love, what I have done during the weekend. So it's like you have to feel if you were receiving some guests in your home, in your living room. So it's more personal. You have to feel close to people. Twitter, on the contrary, is very informative. It's global network to share breaking news or to share information. Instagram is more emotional, is where you feel more creative, you feel like a photographer, and you have to tell a story with an image. YouTube, for example, is very functional. When you need to know about something, you may follow tutorials or you may replace Netflix with YouTube. So you are actually looking for some entertainment or some how to do some things. And LinkedIn is the professional social network itself, where you present yourself and try to connect with people with whom you have something to share with in terms of professional interests. The second key I may identify of empathic people in social media is that we have to master the art of active listening. In the case of social media, please let me know if you can see now a tool I would like to share with you. Do you see the dashboard?
Not yet. Not
No?
yet, not yet, Professor.
Okay, let me share. There we go.
There, we could see it now.
Okay. These tools should be part of our daily social media management, especially if if we speak on behalf of some institutions. These are called social listening tools. What is the information we get from these tools? First, we configure the tools with some keywords. For example, the number of your institution, the terms you are related with, the conversations you would like to engage with in social media. And first, you have the mentions that have been found in at least 13 digital platforms. Here we have what we call the sentiment, which is the attitude towards your publications, if they're either positive, neutral, or negative. Here you see the bubbles, so you see how the conversation is going on social media. So the bigger the circle is, the more impact it has. And if you can see, here we have some lines that tells me how that publication was amplified. So I can see if whether we are facing a crisis or the good impact that a positive information may have had on our audiences. We also have information about the trending phrases related with our conversations of interest, the keywords, and also the trending negative phrases. So we can start or we may design some strategies to balance that information. And we also have a map of influencers. So you may know who are the most active users engaged in certain conversations, in certain topics, and whether if they're positive or negative publication or posted related with your conversation. Here we also have some sort of a keyword mind map, and here we have also the hashtags. Here, finally, we have a map of emotions. So we can also tell if whether the conversation we would like to be engaged with is related with either anger, fear, trust, joy, etc. So this is very important if we are especially managing social media profiles. Am I back to my slides? Yes?
You are, Professor.
Thank you. In that context, a third key sign of empathic people on social media is also we can tune our communication into nonverbal signs. For example, empathic people are aware that communications runs deeper than words alone. For example, when people tell me, is it professional to use emojis or to use hashtags in an institutional communications from a digital, from a religious institutions? Of course it is. It's part of the communication. If you are not seeing the person face to face. Emojis and hashtags give you some context that makes the conversation more vivid and more to make you feel closer. A fourth sign is to pause. Empathic people know how powerful silence can be. So we usually try not to interrupt when other people is talking about, but first to observe and then to engage into the conversation. But especially if you are speaking on behalf of an institution, please let people talk first, observe, and then try to see how your intervention might be useful in that context. A fifth sign is to replace giving advice with asking questions. Remember that when I felt so sad, I didn't expect people to tell me what to do. I only expected people to listen to me, to listen how sad I felt at that point in time. So I would have liked to feel questions such as, how do you feel about it? Can you tell me more? What would be helpful for you? What to make of it? That gives you the sense of these people is actually interested in my situations, regardless they understand or not the situation. If you are also posting on behalf of an institution, I would recommend to speak in the terms of we rather in terms of me, because it's also important that you may feel as part of a community. We need a sense of belongingness, of belonging. We need to think we are part of a communication. And finally, the seventh key sign leads me to give you some final thoughts. The seventh sign is to imagine the other people's point of view, but not only from an intellectual approach, but from three key perspectives: to understand people's needs, people's fears, and people's hopes. Why is it important to take that perspective? Because if we understand the people's needs, fears, and hopes, we are able to connect with them. Why? Because if we understand their needs, we may support them. As the colleague was mentioning before, the chaplains had to support COVID patients and to understand their situations, their fears. They were about to die, and the chaplains were unblocking their fear and what they were experiencing at that time in time. And the hopes, we can encourage that. We can understand what might be your motivation in that specific point in time, and how may I help you feel better in the situation. And connecting with others finally means to start developing a storytelling, a narrative, which might have three key elements. A functional one, because the people need to feel they are being heard, or that there might be a solution, or there might be a positive scenario for them. That narrative also might imply an ethic dimension, because we're talking about values. When I felt so lonely, I felt really misrespected. So I didn't expect people to understand the situation, because they may have not lost a parent, an aunt, and a brother, but they may have at least respected the situation. And also, this narrative should be emotional, because we are given support, because we have to be positive. We have to be positive but realistic. But people need to feel that We are not just a number, that we are a person, that we are a soul that is being heard. So to finalize my intervention, I would like to share with you three recommendations we have worked with in the digital desk at Cygnus about these changes that pandemic has brought to us. The first is regarding digital literacy. It's helping religious leaders to adopt a balanced disposition towards ICT. That's why your interventions have been so insightful and interesting for myself, because I can see a lot of examples of how priests, chaplains, and religious leaders are making that adaptation to this situation. Ongoing formation, because including topics such as pastoral communication, theology, and ICT, and its ethical, theological, and pastoral implications. And finally, peer to peer knowledge sharing. This would mean organizing workshops, seminars, or other spaces such as this one on ICT for lay pastorals leaders to give support also to that complex communication environment. So I just want to finalize with this a quote that says that empathy is feeling the same emotions that another person experiences and responding in a compassionate way. Thank you very much. My greetings from Ecuador, and I would be pleased to listen some comments or ask or questions from yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Navas. Our floor is now open for questions. Father.
Okay. Okay, we have some questions. First, we have questions for Vince. I'm trying to put a bunch of questions together in sort of in a simple, more simple question. The first question is, how do chameleon chaplains, what was the key difference in the way the chaplains tried to bring the sense of hope to the patients during the pandemic versus outside of the pandemic situation?
Thank you for that question. I think there is not really much of a difference with the way the chaplains brought hope, to patients, because they're already ministers of hope to begin with, before the pandemic. They just thought of more creative ways to reach out to these patients via online means to become ministers of hope. Although some of the chaplains that I interviewed admitted that there were struggles, especially during the first months of the pandemic, wherein they were really not able to talk with the patients because they haven't discovered like an online chaplaincy. But through the pandemic, through the months that passed, they were able to discover new means and approaches to become ministers of hope still to the patients and their families as well.
And the second question for Vince is, how does the experience of chaplaincy during the pandemic inform chaplaincy work post-pandemic?
Could you repeat the question?
How does the experience of chaplaincy during the pandemic inform the work of chaplaincy post-pandemic?
Okay. I think this is just my opinion, but with the COVID-19 pandemic, the chaplain's role was highlighted or was given more importance. But other hospitals, they did not really involve their chaplains as frontliners. But I think with this study, we can really call for a more active involvement of the chaplains in the overall wellness, as I introduced earlier, because health does not just mean physical health, but also spiritual health, which is part of the person. So yeah, post-pandemic, we should really consider the role, very important role of chaplains for the patients.
Thank you very much. And we go to Dr. Albertina. Empathy in a different sense, in a different context. The question for Dr. Albertina is, to what extent does hypersensibility play in empathetic communication?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Well, I would like to answer that question, sharing with you something that happened to us. Maybe you may remind that in the beginning of the pandemic, they were globally shared some horrible videos about fire. So everybody received those videos, and that was an actual case of disinformation because there was actual facts. There were a lot of people dying because of COVID in Guayaquil. It was mixed with some false information. They were not putting the course in fire on the streets. That were from a different country in a different context. And they also didn't give the exact context because Guayaquil was the first city in Latin America to experience COVID in such a strong way. So we didn't have protocols at that point in time. So what happened is with hypersensitivity, the people started to talk about in social media about the good and the bads. And so the Ecuadorians were the wild people who did not respect the deaths and were not efficient in managing the COVID situation. And even presidents from another Latin American countries, we are our brothers and sisters, that we are allies, that we are partners, used the Guayaquil situation and tragedy to say we are not that like those people. So this narrative of the heroes and the villains, we're managing the situation better than you, and that like it was a race, who is doing this better, was terribly, terrible for the people. I can tell you as Ecuadorian, that was dramatically unrespectful, and you suffered yourself because people may say it very simple, you are not doing well, but those people dying were Ecuadorians as well. I lived in Guayaquil. I had a lot of friends from Guayaquil, so I felt it a very deep pain. So it was actually non-empathic to see that narrative on social media. How bad is doing Guayaquil? How bad is doing Ecuador? How you are the bads and the rest of the world are the heroes who are doing it well. So it is very sensitive to be engaged in that polarized conversation.
We have several more questions for Dr. Albertina. Unfortunately, I think we still have 3 more speakers. So I'm going to save these questions and I'm going to send them directly to Dr. Albertina, and then she can probably answer them on in the chat box. And then I will go back to Leo now.
Thank you very much, Father. Our next speaker is a member of the faculty of the University of Santo Tomas Senior High School in Manila, Philippines. Aside from teaching, he assists in the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines Committee on Basic Ecclesial Communities, coordinating the programs of various small faith communities of the different parishes and dioceses all over the country. His research interests include contextual theology, liberation theology, Christology, soteriology, popular religiosity, feminism and liberation, postcolonialism. To talk about communicating salvation in the time of a pandemic, life and death, suffering and salvation during the coronavirus crisis, please help me welcome Mr. Frederick Prevosa from the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you, and greetings to all. Let me share my presentation. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this roundtable once again. My topic seems to be broad, but my context will be as a Filipino and as a Christian. And I want to dedicate this paper for those who have died, and those who continue to suffer in this pandemic and this coronavirus crisis. My topic is about communicating salvation in the time of the pandemic, life and death, suffering and salvation during the coronavirus crisis. The longing for salvation is at the very heart of human existence. Everyone hopes to experience salvation, especially those whose lives are deeply immersed in many phases of suffering and drive them to question the meaning of their life and even their faith in God. The experience of salvation, however, is not something that happens in a vacuum. It is always experienced in and through a particular context. According to the great Dominican theologian Edward Schillebeck, whose method and theological reflections on suffering and salvation I will capitalize on this paper, to experience is to interpret at the same time, using models and concepts, patterns, and categories of one's context. So how do we experience, understand, and communicate salvation amidst the COVID-19 pandemic? This is the attempt that this paper would like to present. And as an attempt, this humble work does not claim any finality. This phenomenological study will adopt Edward Schillebeck's hermeneutics of praxis, a method which seeks to establish the relationship between theory and practice. This method is historical, for it seeks to understand faith in its relation to historical periods. Critical, for it looks critically at elements of distortion and power relations and resisting their future repetition. And practical, for it's not only theoretical, rather a practice in faith. In this paper, we will also uncover experiences and reflections of people who were infected by the disease and those who accompanied them and their families. I was fortunate to have 15 respondents who shared with me the sufferings they went through, their hopes, the way they cope with their losses, and the way they understand salvation amidst the present coronavirus crisis. Experience of suffering. The experiences of suffering shared, especially by those infected, include physical and psychological suffering. Others also suffer social and mobility restrictions, and still others relational, like preventing family members to get infected and the death of a relative or a friend. Undeniably, everyone suffers during the pandemic. Economically speaking, the lockdowns imposed had great damage. But in this journey called life, we're always at the crossroads. There are options to make and new paths to tread, especially those who are left behind. Every step we take towards the journey, we must celebrate life. It's not anymore so much about the dead, rather how those left behind cope with the experience of death, how they see how we see ourselves, how do we move on. That is why the journey through grief and the journey through faith is very important. Looking at life as a journey changes your attitude, your purpose, your vision in life right now. Personally, I feel that these past 2 years I've been sharpened by the thought that this is just a journey and the fullness of life gets confirmed and gets enriched by this experience. Many of the respondents acknowledge that salvation in time of the pandemic is a liberation from danger, sickness, and death, as well as protection from spiritual dryness. Others look at salvation as God's healing touch and loving presence. Others express salvation as seeing the hands of God, ever assuring that these too shall pass, and that he is able to do promise despite everything. And another look at it as the only consolation, especially by those who are infected, and the bereaved families of those who have died, and assurance of peace and joy that our communion with the Holy Trinity. Correspondents considered salvation both as present and eschatological hope as the fullness of life. Schillebeck believes that God's salvation occurs in this world and is intrinsically connected to human experience of wholeness and fullness. He is convinced that salvation from God is realized through human beings and the world. Indeed, Schillebeck's present eschatological hope rests on the realization of the humanum, the true invisible humanity, the fullness of life. It begins in the here and now by working for happiness and goodness of humankind in creation. It ends with eschatological hope, which according to him remains unpredictable, undefinable, a mystery which rests on God's graciously excessive gift. He envisions it as total elimination of suffering from history, reconciliation with living in the dead, and the fullness of life. Thus, view of salvation as fullness of life is not contrary to faith. Even in the New Testament, Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it to the full. How do we then communicate salvation as fullness of life during the pandemic crisis? What are we going to communicate? These are simply a proposal. First, that pandemic is not a scourge of a vengeful God. I remember talking to a lady in her 50s in a public market in Manila, and she said that the pandemic is God's way of reducing people in the world. This may sound ridiculous, but her thoughts is shared by many who considers the pandemic as the punishment from God or a sign of the apocalypse. And whether we like it or not, religion or the way we communicate the image of God has a piece of cake in this. Whenever the immediate causes of a phenomenon is not readily explicable, there's always a human tendency to directly implicate God. All of a sudden, the generous and loving God is turned to a vengeful one. According to biblical scholar J. Goldingay, the story of Job and the other Old Testament stories reflect that one must not always assume that plagues, epidemics, disasters in the scriptures are punishment. According to him, the view that the Old Testament generally makes a tight link between sin and disaster is just a myth. Perhaps because deber, the Hebrew word for a plague or epidemic, commonly has God as a subject, so God is always accused as the one who brings disasters, even if it's not really the case. Hence, the pandemic does not begin with nor pleases God, neither as part of the ongoing story. The latest report from WHO says that the pandemic is zoonotic in source, although debate on the disease origin remains open. Nonetheless, the pandemic and natural disasters are not punishment from God. The Catechism explains that they are part of nature being in the state of journeying. Even the Filipino Catechism says that they result from the kind of limited universe in which we live. In January 2020, in the occurrence of succeeding natural calamities locally and globally, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, or CBCP, released a pastoral statement that natural calamities are not scourge of the vengeful God. Rather, they are signs that we are still living in an imperfect natural world. The second, that salvation includes the now. One aspect of salvation that still permits in the present consciousness is to regard salvation merely or only as a matter of the afterlife, or reduce its notion simply as salvation of souls. Such is shaped by the dualistic perspective popularized in the Middle Ages that considers the world and the body, together with the devil, as enemies, that nothing was more essential than the soul, only the soul. But prior to its Christian usage, salvation is understood as deliverance from evil, which defined it only as spiritual but also social, political, economic, psychological, demographic, etc. A form of earthly, or shall we say, secular salvation. Salvation is not simply otherworldly. For Skilebex, it includes liberation from personal, social oppressions and alienations leading to an experience of fullness, or the attainment of the humanum, the true and livable humanity, the fullness of life here in the here and now. Furthermore, salvation is universal, as it is a gift from God, the God who is proclaimed as the God of all humanity, the God of all nations, the God of all creation, the God of all religions. Salvation must therefore be communicated as good news to all human beings without discrimination. The fullness of life, after all, is for all religions, and I believe the goal of all religions. Thirdly, salvation includes acts of love offered by science. The ideology that science is opposed to faith still exists today. The thinking that scientific advancements has no place in God's salvific plan still permits. Yes, we do not pay blind eye to the unacceptable processes and inventions that science and technology created, to which the church and other religions also expressed dismay and readily offered fraternal correction. But we also should acknowledge the good things that science and technology has brought to humankind. The pandemic has taught us that science can also contribute to the experience of the fullness of life in the here and the now. The CBCP, at the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, has released several circulars urging the faithful to cooperate in the measures to keep people safe and healthy, like social and physical distancing and abiding to hygiene protocols. Dioceses and parishes were encouraged to have the celebration of the Eucharist and other services transmitted via the internet, television, or radio to continue providing spiritual support to people. Moreover, the development of COVID-19 vaccine gives people hope, and the CBCP joined people around the world in welcoming this advancement. Several senior prelates even volunteered to be among the first ones to be vaccinated to help build trust in the vaccine and eradicate hesitancies and even conspiracy theories. Vaccine hesitancy, perhaps due to lack of information or prevalence of disinformation, is disturbing. That is why Pope Francis encouraged everyone to avail of the vaccine authorized by the respective authorities, calling it an act of love. For love is always social and political. He said, getting vaccinated is a simple yet profound way to care for one another, especially the most vulnerable. In proper perspective, that is, looking at freedom in right context, following good scientific advice for the good of humanity, like abiding health standards, written the vaccine is a way to experience fullness of life and also let others experience the same. This is something that we really have to communicate loud and clear. And lastly, salvation includes human solidarity. One of the respondents said that salvation is seeing people assist one another and provide for their needs. The fullness of life cannot be without human solidarity. Goldingay said that although it is not much emphasized, narratives of plagues and epidemic in the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus requires people to give concrete expression of love for their neighbor. As Filipinos, one of our greatest concrete expression of solidarity this pandemic here in the Philippines is the mushrooming of community pantries in different places. As also shared by Father Norman last night, this was initiated by Patricia Non, a 26-year-old entrepreneur. And the reminder, popularized in that Maginhawa community pantry, give what you can, take only what you need, became a banner and call for solidarity. Many individuals and groups also donated PPEs to frontliners and hospitals, offered free counseling services, free seedlings and saplings to those who would like to plant them, known as community pantry, free transportation to those medical frontliners and those with immediate medical attention. However, we do not also discount the fact that during the pandemic, there are also those who took advantage of the situation. Presently, we are also on the lookout on how the pandemic situation in the Philippines will be used for the upcoming national election. Yes, the pandemic has brought out both the best and the worst in us. But as history has shown, the power of human solidarity embedded in our consciousness as Filipinos will always find its way to emerge. Indeed, the community pantries in various forms of solidarity resurrected the spirit of bayanihan, an indigenous Filipino trait, although not peculiar to Filipinos alone. This trait still exists, but has become more pronounced and given more profound meaning due to the experience of the pandemic. To conclude, the pandemic put us in a situation of complex experience. The various forms of suffering evoke hope for a better future. The encounter with death evokes discernment on the meaning of life. The pandemic also made even more pronounced the human solidarity to journey towards the fullness of life. It also enabled us to evaluate our faith in an image of God, the giver of this fullness. The call to experience the fullness of life in the here and the now invites us individually and collectively to follow St. Paul's advice. Rejoice in hope, be patient under trials, persevere in prayer. Until we reach the promised completeness of life's fullness, an unpredictable, undefinable mystery which rests on God's graciously excessive gift. I'd like to end this reflective presentation with this letter shared with me by my former students, Vanessa. This was written by her grandmother, Evelyn, days before she was hospitalized and eventually passed away due to COVID-19. Dear Heavenly Father, today, August 12, 2021, I wrote this letter for you to thank you for the beautiful life you've given me. I consider it, Lord, a perfect one. You have blessed me with so many things, and I could not ask for more. I will continue to trust you and have faith that anything you will bestow upon me will all be beautiful. I love you, Lord, and in Jesus' name I pray. Evelyn. She died on September 16, but her family and I are convinced that Evelyn has finally attained God's gracious gift of the fullness of life, which Saint Paul described as no one has seen, no ear has heard, no human heart has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Prevosa. Let me go on immediately to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is a layperson from Singapore who teaches and consults for the East Asian Pastoral Institute and the Jesuit Conference of Asia Pacific. She has a PhD in religion and theology from the Australian Catholic University. Her research focuses on theological methods for church-society dialogue. To speak about the search for meaning and values in the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, paradigm shifts in communicating the joy of the gospel, please help me welcome Professor Christina King from Singapore.
Thank you. Hello. I will share my screen. Okay, you can see my screen, right? All right. Let me start with a quote from Pope Francis in the scene that we'll all remember forever, more than 1 year ago, in that dark rainy night at St. Peter's Square in his Ubi et Orbi address. And he was spot on when he said, "We have gone ahead at breakneck speed, feeling powerful and able to do anything, and we did not stop at God's approach to us. And now we are in a stormy sea." Indeed, he really, really captured the mood and the meaning and the significance of that moment. What I would like to first highlight, as we have all seen in these past 2 days, that dealing with the COVID pandemic it's not something where practical wisdom alone is enough, not just practical solutions, but it's something that needs to be addressed where we talk about fundamental values, principles, worldviews, and even ultimate purpose. I think that's something that many presenters have been saying in these 2 days. It's something that COVID is something that has really prompted humanity to relook and rethink our underlying values, our view of reality. The Pope has also said that, God is calling us to seize this time of trial as a time of choosing, a time to choose what matters and what passes away, a time to separate what is necessary from what is not. It is a time to get our lives back on track with regard to you, Lord, and to others. I would like to highlight that it's not just COVID, but humanity as a whole is going through a very decisive moment in history. We have climate change. COP26 is going on now as we speak. Many social political upheavals in our countries, inequality, global power tensions, especially the rising tensions between the West and China. Digital transformation, religious and cultural shifts as well. And as we have seen in these 2 days, the compromise of truth. So we are really living in a critical time for humanity where we need to examine and clarify philosophical foundations, not just pragmatic solutions, but really philosophical foundations. What is real, true, and good? I would like to suggest that the Catholic Church does have something valuable to contribute to humanity's present need. In our catechism, it says that the catechesis on creation concerns the very foundations of human and Christian life, for it makes explicit the response of the Christian faith to the basic question that people of all times have asked themselves: where does everything that exists come from, and where is it going? These two questions are decisive for the meaning and orientation of our life and actions. But I would say that although, the catechism with very good intention does put forth some answers for all these big questions of life, still we must admit that we don't have all the answers. And so what I would like to focus in my presentation today is that to witness to the joy of the gospel more effectively in a pandemic and post-pandemic world, the Catholic Church itself needs to undergo some paradigm shifts in the way it looks at mission, in the way it goes about religious communication. The first paradigm shift is from preaching to promoting a journey of inquiring together. We could safely say that in the church's current approach, we see ourselves as a teacher. We assume a didactic role, whether it's through our catechesis, education, schools, social advocacy, even our witness of life, our social communications, our digital media, our pastoral activities. We primarily automatically assume by default that we are the teacher. We have something to teach others. Even if we are campaigning out in the streets, we have something to teach others. So we see ourselves like a beacon, a lighthouse, giving the light to others. And in scripture, of course, indeed we are. But in these unprecedented times, we must admit that all parties have more questions than answers. And not only that, but all parties are equally culpable. Even besides the pandemic, the church is struggling with so many internal crises itself, crisis about abuses, financial scandals, lack of governance, clericalism, spiritual worldliness, so many different things. And both society and the church have more questions than answers. I teach at the East Asian Pastoral Institute, and my students are religious and clergy undergoing, doing the sabbatical or ongoing formation. And many of them say that they really don't know how to answer their people when they are asked, why does God allow COVID? How to cope with such a prolonged time of the pandemic. They themselves have more questions than answers. So this is a situation where no one really is the teacher, but and it's something that requires more than dialogue, because dialogue also assumes that we have answers to share. We share our existing doctrines. So much more than dialogue, this is a time that requires a process of seeking, learning, discovering together. So the paradigm shift I'd like to advocate, first of all, is for the church to be a fellow pilgrim. It's like a Copernican revolution. We need to see ourselves as a fellow pilgrim with others, to raise the questions together, to seek together. In talking about synodality, the Pope has said that a synodal church is one where everyone listens, which realizes that listening is more than simply hearing. It is a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. And this is the stance that we need to adopt. And so we might find out that when we adopt this stance, then it's the synodal experience of mutual accompaniment, of joint seeking, journeying, listening, lamenting, and healing. It is this mutuality that transforms us, not so much the answer itself, but it's the mutuality that transforms us, consoles us, brings us joy and wisdom, and helps us realize our profound fraternity, even if we have not found the answers yet. But this stance of walking together, this group of people you see here, it is that journey of asking and seeking and trying to find out the answers together, that we feel the consolation and realize how fraternal and how connected we actually are. What are the implications then for religious communication? This paradigm shift implies that religious communication must do more of not just telling, putting out the stories and information, but to facilitate collaborative inquiry. We must create spaces for joint questioning, for exploring, expressing, lamenting safely with one another, for listening, and for discovering. It's a much more interactive space, and it's a space that requires risk-taking. It's also a space where we need to learn more methods and apply them, methods for collaborative learning and discernment. And I was very happy to hear about Daniela's method of the mystagogy, how that process can be applied too. And I find it very, very relevant to COVID, our experience of COVID as a whole. Even for myself, as I was listening to her, I feel that, I want a group where I can process my experience of the online liturgy. It's very raw to me. It's still a raw experience. I really need to sit down with people and process it, but I need a method of processing it. The example I've given here in my slide is Bernard Lonergan's transcendental method, which involves 4 steps: experience, understanding, judgment, and decision. I'm sure there are many more. It also requires a lot more intellectual humility of admitting that we don't have all the answers and that we are open to learning. So that's the first paradigm shift. The second paradigm shift is from maintenance to missionary outreach. I hear all too often from my students as well as from my peers that the churches, many of the parishes and ministers' current preoccupations is with safe distancing, maintaining, trying to restore the liturgy and sacraments in a limited way. A lot of them are bogged down with ecclesial administration, with personnel and financial sustainability. No one goes to mass anymore. They don't have the mass donations, and some are trying to do pastoral care within the limits. And I've seen how, a lot of church institutions and even parishes, they are just doing the minimum at the moment because they were so afraid of violating safe distancing rules. That's okay, but the danger is that after a prolonged period of doing just the minimum, we become trapped in what we call a tomb psychology, as Pope Francis said in Evangelii Gaudium. We become like mummies in a museum. We are very comfortable in the cave, and we just remain in the cave. Sometimes I propose to a pastor, why don't we start to open up already, because the government has relaxed the rules. And then they say, oh no, it's too difficult. You need a lot of new things to do, although people can come, but it's just too difficult. So there's a certain feeling, there's a certain lethargy that has set in after 2 years. And I'm afraid that this lethargy will continue, such that we don't open up. Even if we can open up, we don't take the risk of opening up. So that's one thing to be careful of. The paradigm shift that's needed is what Pope Francis says in Evangelii Gaudium. No, mere administration administration case, it's never enough. Let's be permanently in a state of mission. Let's reach out to new frontiers. We really need to collaborate with wider society to build back better. There are a lot of conversations taking place, building back greener, building back more sustainably. Where is the church's voice in all these conversations? I think the young people have even gone faster than us. Also, we need to help people to pause and recover depth in life, as what Laudato Si is saying. This time of COVID is really a very opportune time to get people to stop and think and go deeper. And also to help society regain its soul after this time of really a crisis, where all our strengths and weaknesses are exposed. So the implications for religious communication is first to venture out to new audiences, to take risks, go out to non-believers, even business community, secular tertiary institutions, civic networks, local neighborhoods, Generation Z, etc. Don't just stay within the comfort zone of your Catholic audience. The second implication is that we must also promote individual and collective reflection. Social media has a tendency to make things very superficial. So we have to counteract that. We have to promote discernment about ultimate truths and values, and bring people to the depths of their hearts and minds where a genuine conversion can occur. We have to promote deeper reflection. The third paradigm shift is from exclusive to universal languages for divine truths. What do I mean by that? The current style of discourse in the church's evangelization is a very inward-looking. There's a lot of direct use of religious language. We talk about sin and salvation. We talk about sacraments. There's a lot of so-called church speak, which a lot of people nowadays don't understand and don't relate to. And so our way of communicating, not all, I'm just saying, there's still some, it tends to be doctrine-centered rather than audience-centered, really like the presentation just now about empathy. Think in terms of the audience's point of view. We tend to have conventional notions of God, and when someone else has a different notion of God, we straight away reject them, or we criticize them and cut them off and put them down. And so as a result of all these limitations, we lack connection with today's listener, with today's audience. We really lack a connection with them. There is exclusivism. Only the in crowd understands what we are talking about. Misunderstanding as well. And we increase the church-society boundary, and we draw a thick line between us and them. So the COVID crisis and other crises really shows that humanity is groaning and groping for meaning and for answers, for the principle of existence. So the paradigm shift that we need to make is to adopt more universal and relatable notions and languages for divine realities, and not just stick so strictly to our existing languages for God. Also, again, the previous presenter highlighted Jesus's way of teaching, where he used everyday concepts like nature, food, and relationships, rather than abstract religious ideas. In that way, the non-Jews, the Gentiles, can relate to it, and they feel included. They feel like he's talking to them. So, likewise, today, when we communicate, do the non-Christians feel included? Can they relate to what we are talking about? Or do they see us as well educated? So that's where we have to examine ourselves. And if we make this paradigm shift, we can re-achieve again a re-enchanted world. Charles Taylor talks about a disenchanted world where God is really separated out. But, relationship with God is meant for all humanity rather than just one religious community. So the implication for religious communication is first to listen, not to start by talking, but start by listening. Listen to the language of people today. How do they experience the divine? How do they express it? And to enter through their door and then to learn from them to expand our notions of God. Let me give you an example. Alan Lightman, he's an atheist. He regards himself as an atheist. He's a physicist as well as a novelist. And in this wonderful book that he wrote, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine, he writes this description. He shares this feeling he had on one night when he was in a boat looking out at the stars in the dark sky, like you see in this picture. And he writes, I felt an overwhelming connection to the stars, as if I were a part of them, and the vast expanse of time extending from the far distant past long before I was born, and then into the far distant future long after I will die, seemed compressed to a dot. I felt connected not only to the stars, but to all of nature and to the entire cosmos. I felt a merging with something far larger than myself, a grand and eternal unity, a hint of something absolute. And this is an atheist talking. So if we open our ears and we are more open-minded, and we can listen to them, then we catch their language and we try to enter through their door.
Yes,
Again,
Dr. King,
yes.
5 minutes left.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Another novelist, Meira Chan, also writes that a nameless presence within us all, so often hidden or forgotten by our everyday selves, provides calm and resilience in the face of adversity, if we will but acknowledge it. So they may not be explicitly talking about God in the way that we think about God, but they are talking about something. What is that something? It's something special, something deep, something divine. So we need to be open to listen and to enter through that door and explore together with them. The fourth paradigm shift is from theoretical discourse to contemplation. And the current tendency is that we focus on literary and rational forms, verbal and rational forms, and we go for cognitive clarity and precise definition. What is salvation? What is sin? What is God? Who is Christ? What is the church? But the current crisis require confrontation with profound truths, which are often beyond words. So the paradigm shift we need to make is to go into more contemplative forms of knowing inside the human heart. And Gaudium et Spes says that we plunge into our hearts, into the depths of reality when we enter into our heart. The International Theological Commission says that it's also an instinct. It's not just rational deliberation. It's spontaneous. It's different from objective knowledge. It's a knowledge of the heart. Again, another atheist writes in this way that, he felt something very deep, very real, very sure. It is not just in verbal terms, but he knows it. He feels it. He knows that's true. He knows it deep down in our heart. So in our religious communication, how do we facilitate what I would call epistemologies of the heart, something that go beyond words, contemplation, aesthetics, nature, and all that, including silence? How do we encourage contemplation in a world of 24/7 media? And I have here a quote from St. Ignatius of this kind of inner realization that happens to him in a moment of contemplation. Also, there are images that can invoke a deep resonance beyond words. So how do we use that? And the final paradigm shift is in terms of how we approach mission, playing a dominant and leading role in our institutions. But by doing this, we invoke suspicions of proselytization, and also there are new protagonists. So we need to do more collaboration and networking. And this is where we need to find out where the key activities are taking place and collaborate with them. And when we collaborate, we can promote dialogue towards universal values and ultimate truth. Here I have some quotations, and I think you will well know already of how it is possible for humanity to have a sense of universal absolute truth, to know what is right. How do we know what is right? We have that interior sense deep within us, and it is possible. So these are the 5 paradigm shifts that I propose we can adopt as we go through COVID and beyond.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for that wonderful presentation. I will skip the introduction and proceed right away to my presentation. I hope you are still with us. I know we've been having this for more than 2 hours already, but this is the last one. All right. So I'm Leo Ocampo from the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, and I'm going to talk about Catholic liturgical teleparticipation before, during the pandemic, and questions for the new normal. Something that ties up with a lot of the presentations this evening. Actually, this article can be read already in full in the most recent issue of Religion and Social Communication. So if you wanted more details, you can just read it up in Religion and Social Communication. But anyway, let me just give you the gist of my article so you can whet your appetite, and probably I can seduce you to read the article in the journal and to read the journal itself, which has a lot of good articles about the pandemic, not to mention the tribute to Father Eilers as well. So it's a very good issue. Thank you to Father Anthony, and congratulations to ARC. But anyway, I begin with Saint Clare. No, it is said, yes. Oh, aren't they? Wait, let me redo it. Uh-huh. Wait, it says here. Does it come out now? All right. So let me start with Saint Clare. By the way, here's the cover of the recent issue of Religion and Social Communication. So let's start with Saint Clare. It is said that one Christmas night, Saint Clare was too sick. No, so there's that element of sickness similar to COVID-19, but of course she didn't have COVID, but she was isolated and she was bedridden. So basically, she could not attend mass. The element of isolation is there, distance from the sacraments, and what she experienced was she wanted so much to attend the mass in the nearby church, and maybe pitying her state, the Holy Spirit projected the Mass into the wall of her convent so that she could see it vividly before her eyes, as if she was there in person. So that is how the experience was described, as if she was there in person. So you have also the element of immersiveness, no, in this particular miracle, so to speak, which earned her the patronage of television as declared by Pius XII eventually. No? So we have that miracle in the 13th century. Now, fast forward, now let's look at teleparticipation and how it evolved. Of course, that's the supernatural TV. Let's look now at the human TV. So pre-pandemic, we had film and radio coming in 1895, no, television in 1927. I'll just give you the dates. No, and how did the church adopt this, the Catholic Church? Now, in 1931, we had the first radio blessing on the occasion of the blessing of Radio Vaticana. No, and at least in the documents, there was an official welcome. But Father Eilers tells us that even during that time, there was actually an initial reticence on the part of theologians. I don't know if this will be interesting to Ma'am Daniela, but for example, Karl Rahner did not want liturgies to be broadcast because he believed that this belonged to the arcane discipline of the church. Now, only the baptized were supposed to be introduced to these things. No, so broadcasting them unnecessarily exposed them to those who do not believe. No, imagine you are streaming the mass on YouTube. Someone who does not really believe it might watch it and ridicule it. No, so it becomes open for sacrilege. There were those concerns even at the start. So pre-pandemic, we had that, and of course, in your own dioceses and parishes, what was the situation? Here in the Philippines, at least I can say, initially we were limited to radio and Sunday TV masses. No, we did not have online masses, except as far as I know, we only had in Manila at least 4 shrines. But even then, it was not very popular. No, while the world already had internet starting in 1969, the internet was barely explored, at least for liturgical use. The church was using it for web pages. We were using email. We had some form of social networks. No, the bishops had their blogs. Even the Pope has his Twitter. No, but we did not see online masses in this scale before the pandemic. What we had in the form of liturgical broadcast was usually just radio or televised masses, but even the televised masses were canned. Now, the pandemic came and it took us by surprise. So even the world had to shift. So many sectors of the world had to shift online, not just faith community. So industry shifted, education shifted. Now we have a number of teachers here. Many of us were not really doing online yet before, or maybe we were doing it only partially, but all of a sudden we had to do it almost completely. No, even businesses, they had to migrate online, or else they died out, no, because of the lockdowns. Now, what was the church response? No, initially, the bishop's response was to suspend the precept of obligation. So you are not obliged to go to mass. But it went on, and there was a spiritual hunger. So they were in a quandary, should we replay the canned TV masses? And there were those who did that. No, but the canned TV masses, if you saw them during the pandemic, they look so out of touch with reality. There was one local station here in the Philippines who showed a Christmas mass. The people did not have their face masks on. No, and during the sign of peace, they hugged each other. Kenneth is smiling. Maybe he knows the producer of the mass. No, so it's clearly out of touch. No, in the homily, there's no reference to what is going on. No, so it violates everything that we know should be present in a canned, not a canned, no, in a broadcast liturgy. No, that it should still connect with the reality of the people. This one, remote, no, because really it was canned from 2 or 3 years ago because they could not can because of the lockdown. No? And then there was the question of the daily masses because there were no canned televised daily masses. No? Usually the TV masses were only Sunday masses. So how to respond to those who desire to have a daily mass? So there you have the online masses. And my argument is the online masses actually brought liturgical broadcast to a whole new level. If you will use the Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, Web 4 language, radio and TV masses are at the most Web 1 or at the most maybe Web 2. if you broadcast them on social media. But the online masses, well, for one, it's not just a plain broadcast. If you live stream it on Facebook, like what we are doing now with our conference, no, even if it's just on Facebook or on YouTube, you get the number of viewers. So you realize that there are at least 5 of you, maybe you are attending Mass, or 20, or in the case of the Manila Cathedral, as the first presentation showed, there are so many of you attending. So even if it's just a number, there is a sense of community. It's very Web 2. No? It's a small thing, no? But in a time of pandemic where community is very important, it's a big thing. Web 3 also, no, the user sensitivity, because of the algorithms, those who were always attending Mass would find that they are being, their social media, because they always click on the masses, no, are being fed with masses, with consoling posts, with spiritual thoughts. No? So it was a very consoling experience. And that is why the online masses also became popular, because the social media entities themselves, the platforms, sense that actually, at least here in the Philippines, in our experience, the people were picking it up. No? It was something that mattered to the people. Later, I'll show you the statistics for the Philippines. And actually, with that kind of
Leo, I just want to
yes,
remind you that you have about 10 minutes left only,
yes,
so you might want to skip to the meaty part of your presentation.
yes, Father. I'll take care of the time. So actually, with the kind of technology we have, we can even have Web 4, no, Zoom Mass, where the lectors can participate, no, and then some possibility even of receiving communion. So you participate in Zoom, and then you receive communion in the car park or in the drive-through, no, or the communion can be brought to your house. So it's something unthought of, no, before the pandemic. Now, what happens to the post-pandemic? No? But before we go there, here's the meaty part. No? So the distance has been dying, no, but the church is not really, at least in theory, in support of this death of distance. Now, the stand of the church is very clear, as you can see in the post, which came out when the lockdowns were easing. Virtual celebrations are devotional and not sacramental. So just imagine all that thing that the first presenters were very excited about, Simbayan, doing so much. That's nothing to officially. No, it does not hold water. No, the church is very clear. Virtual reality is no substitute for the real presence of Christ. There are no sacraments on the internet. No, I'm thinking of the kid of Ma'am Daniela, no, with all those toys. No, even if she had an experience of the sacred, no, mystagogy and all, in the official mind of the church, even the religious experiences like this possible there are insufficient. That's the official wording. No, church and internet is the name of the document, which looks very detached from our experience. You know, in the Philippines, in January 2001, the top trending keyword on Facebook was faith, faith-related words. This is according to data statistics. Now, the second greatest influencer was not the Manila Cathedral, Quiapo Church. So you can imagine the physical church is empty because of the lockdown, but actually there are more people attending there because of the online. Even in the Vatican, I think Ma'am Keng mentioned a while ago that Urbi et Orbi of Pope Francis, no? So many watching. It was an empty square, but so many were actually tuned in, no? And in his daily masses, no, as many as 6,000 viewers in that small chapel in Santa Marta. Now, how can you cram 6,000 viewers there? But see, even the Pope, no, has this to say about online masses. He says, I say this because someone made me reflect, no, about the danger brought about by this moment. The pandemic that has made us communicate through the media, even in matters of religion. So he says, in this Mass, we are all communicating. No? We are together, spiritually together. The people present are few, but there are many people attending, but they are not together. This is Pope Francis speaking. No? even when it comes to the sacrament that you are receiving, the people who are connected, they can have spiritual communion, but it's not communion. It's not the Eucharist. And this isn't the church. No, this is the church in a difficult situation. No, but not the church. So there's a disconnect apparently. No? And actually, even the Holy Father, he was very reluctant to have his online masses. He had to be persuaded. And the soonest that he could discontinue the online masses, he discontinued them. No? The soonest, they into the Eucharist with joy. So what were the online masses? They were not Eucharist, at least in the mind of the hierarchy. No, the real Eucharist is only the face-to-face. Let us return to the Eucharist with joy. And so what we had is not Eucharist. So there is the problem that I would like to face. And as I think, as the earlier presenters mentioned, I think it was Dr. Daniela, who said, this is a space for conversation. There's a very fertile theological ground here. No? Do we make sense of online masses? Do we slowly break the ice? No? Do we open up the mind of the church about it? No? Or do we go back to the pre-pandemic? Or do we go back to the old normal? Because at least, no, in the mind of the official documents, that's the invitation. Let's go back to the Eucharist with joy. So we will not continue the online mass anymore, even if it is significantly better than the radio and the Can Sunday TV masses. Now, we're not saying it will replace the Eucharist face-to-face, no? But it could be explored for, say, sick people, prisoners, no, cannot go to mass, those who have soldiers, no? For those situations, those who are unable to attend the mass. And there's a clamor for it. No, when the Pope was about to change, to discontinue his masses, there was a lot of clamor for it to continue, but it was not continued. Now, just to start the conversation, I also wrote another article in Landa, nation of the question. And again, it's an open question, I think. No, something for us in this field of religion and social communication, especially the Catholic, can mull about. No? Here I address three common objections to the online mass, which came from Francis himself. No? The first objection is there is no community. But my argument is there can be some community. No? And you can, I will not spoil the fun. No? You can find the article. No? It's in Landas 33. It's 2019 because Landas is a little late. No? I'm not a prophet. It's just that they're late in publishing. So it's still 2019. Then we have the body in the liturgy. No? That's one other common objection. Because in the mind of the church, virtual does not involve the body. Does not involve persons, but they don't realize I am a body now speaking here in Manila to you. You are all bodies listening to me. No, so even if our round table is virtual, we are present. No, and we are in our bodies. No, and even the computer is part of the cosmos. No, and even though you cannot pour holy oil and let it go through the digital highways, no, I wonder, even if you put it in a sachet, no, there are obvious limitations. That's it. No, eventually you'll realize it cannot be the same thing. No, but what a waste if the original inspiration is lost, especially if the Lord does not seem to be against it. No, He did it for Saint Clare. No, why can't we retain some of the advantages, no, the affordances, as the technical term would put it, no, at present? So that's the gist of my article. You can read it if you want, and hopefully, we can have more theological conversations about this. We can have more articles written about this. It's a very exciting field, and hopefully, we will not lose this altogether. Thank you very much, and thank you also to my fellow presenters for the last leg. So the table is now open for questions to the last three presenters. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes before we need to say goodbye. So we have some questions here. I would like to maybe just to open it up and see who wants to address this question from the three presenters. This question is quite long. This is from Father Norman. This is a pertinent point of discussion. Considering the OFWs, what is OFWs?
Father, overseas Filipino workers.
Oh, overseas Filipino workers, or maybe migrants in countries where Eucharist is not allowed. So they watch online. What they watch that gives them hope and inspiration in their work are not real and transformative. So maybe Leo and Christina can both address this question as well. Okay, we can we start with Christina?
I think this question is more for Leo.
Leo? Okay, so we'll have Leo answer this question then.
Yeah, that's the problem. No, we have a double standard. We allow the TV mass canned. No, we allow the radio mass, but we are allergic to the online mass. No, and we believe that the indulgence can flow during the Pope's Urbi et Orbi blessing, because they announced that. No, those who are following this broadcast through the internet, those who are following this radio television will also receive the indulgence. So the indulgence can flow, but sacramental grace, not even 10% cannot. No, if you will follow the quote. So actually, all of that is useless. No, I wonder how. I would like to hear from the first group. No, how do they feel about this? Because this is the official teaching. No, actually, it's better to say the rosary than to attend the online mass. If you look at the catechism, if you cannot go to mass, you say the rosary. You don't watch mass on TV.
And do we have any response from any of our presenters to Leo's question? Okay.
Sir Leo, I totally agree with you, because I think that's one idea, or that's one concept that our people today should consider, that the online mass, the online celebrations, it cannot totally replace the actual celebration, the actual sacrament that we have, which can, in reality, it can never really be administered online. So I think we should I think this is a point of reflection for all of us educators, religious leaders. How can we encourage the faithful to see this as only a temporary solution, that it is not forever? That time will come that we should go back to the church. So thank you, Sir Leo. I really appreciated your points in your article. I hope to read it soon, sir. Thank you.
Yes, actually, that's my problem, Joshua. It should not be temporary. No, there is something in the online mass that we have not seen before the pandemic, which may be valuable to us even after the pandemic. Now imagine if the sick people will attend the Zoom mass and will be given communion after by a lay minister, instead of being content with a radio mass or a Sunday mass. It's a huge difference. No, and they can attend through Zoom. On that one, I would like to address Dr. Daniela. No? Dr. Daniela, I'm hoping, and I'm a fan of your book. I have your book. No? It's locally reprinted, but I have it. No? And I think thinkers like you, are pushing the frontiers of theology. No? And thank you for that. No? Unfortunately, if you look at the official documents, during COVID, there were 2 instructions that came out. No? And then that document that was returned to the Eucharist with joy, they don't seem to acknowledge the value of what we discovered during the pandemic. And all of that runs the risk of being lost. No? Thankfully, we have theologians, to keep the fire, to help them see that there is something that the Spirit is probably working here. No? And it is not something that we should abandon and consider only as a pandemic thing. No? This might actually be an improvement. So, I've said too much.
I've addressed this question in some of my writings as well, because it seems to me that there's sort of an irony that at the same time we find that throughout this pandemic, many of the religious leaders have been forced to or have willingly gone on to cyberspace in order to carry out their pastoral activities that otherwise they wouldn't be able to. And that at the same time that there's sort of this kind of hesitancy, so at the same time that, okay, we're going to use it, we're going to go on the internet, we're going to make use of digital technology, but then at the same time, we're not going to be acknowledging the value of it, because we might risk of, placing too much value on it, and then at the cost of this in-person and physical traditions that we used to have. So we find that in the pastoral religious leaders, there's this sort of bipolarity, and I think that maybe the church leaders need to really sit down and think about, okay, what are they doing? You can't be at the same time making use of it and then at the same time rejecting it, and that seems to be kind of this mindset, because we're not sure what to do with this instrument. It's very useful, but are we going to accept it? How are we going to deal with it? I think there's a lot of religious leaders are still in that space of hesitancy, and maybe there needs to be more explorations as time goes on. Christina and Daniela, do you have any input in this matter?
Just really briefly, I appreciate the conversation, and I would say I'm not sure if it's as much as a question or problem to figure out as, and this is something I'm quoting Antonio Spadaro here, an ambiance or a culture to inhabit and to understand the shape of that. So, and I put this in the chat, Church and Internet was 20 years ago, that document, and I don't expect the theology of sacraments to change, but thinking differently about this experience of being together communally and what that surely has some value, and what does that value mean for our life of faith. We don't have to redefine sacraments, but we can maybe extend what participation looks like in some ways. I don't know. I do think it's an ambiance to it, something we're living in rather than a problem that's in front of us. I would just contribute that.
Christina, do you have any input?
Yes, on this matter, I would say that it's very important for the pastors to listen to the people's experience. As a doctrine always is always catching up with experience, like the Holy Spirit falling on the family of Cornelius, who is a Gentile before he was baptized, and also in Acts chapter 15, the Council of Jerusalem, where doctrine has to change because of experience. So this is an example where we can't form conclusions yet either way. And I think all sides really need to listen to one another and slowly, maybe explore what is really happening.
I know that in the past, Christina, you've mentioned about the internet playing a role in the synodal church. That means that there are voices on the internet, and I've also expressed this too, because there are many different groups on the internet who only go on the internet in order to express themselves. And so, if we want to establish a synodal church, we really need to look to those spaces, digital spaces, in order to get to those voices. And I think that's part of the exploration that you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. All means and channels. That's useful, and anything can be used for anything. God can use anything, really. But at the same time, I think for human beings, we also need to be discerning. I know people who are kind of like abusing the system in that they remain with the online mass even though they can go for the physical mass. and they flip channels to find the online mass that has someone that they like or is the shortest, or they just watch it at a convenient time. So it becomes very consumeristic. So either way can be abused. That's why we really need to look down into our hearts and examine and do good discernment.
Frederick, you had your hand up before. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, actually, what I want to say has been mentioned already by you, Father Leduc. But I just like to continue that. Yeah, I think we have to take advantage of the time that the church has opened herself for the synodality, and this is really meant that everyone should be heard, and that includes us, the voices in the sidelines, that want also to be heard. And I don't know how can we go far, or will we really be heard? But the point is, we really have to speak and to say something. Well, as for my experience, the church was always hesitant on new things, on new experiences. It always looks at the disadvantage than the benefit. It's always to safeguard something rather than to promote something. And I think that is something that the church has been doing, but now that it has opened her doors for synodality, for us to be heard, and then we have to speak, and we really have to let our voices be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we're approaching 10 p.m., which is in Bangkok, which is 11 p.m. in Christina's in the Philippines as well. And so I think maybe this is a good time for us to not stop the conversation, but to take a pause, and then we'll continue the conversation in some other forums, in some other spaces, either physical or digital, that because the kind of conversation that we've been engaging in throughout these 2 days is not something that we can really come to any conclusions with at this time, isn't it? But like the theme of the ARC for this year is just to examine models and strategies and to see where we're going. And so with these last 2 days, yesterday we had more of an inter-religious and intercultural perspective. Today we had primarily a Catholic perspective, but both sort of supplement each other, and also to reinforce this idea that dialogue and interdisciplinary exchanges is something that we continue to have to engage in. And this year, in an ironic way, with the thanks to the pandemic, we're able to engage more wisdom from other parts of the world that we at the roundtable of the ARC normally wouldn't have, which is the contribution of Dr. Daniela all the way from the US, and then Albertina all the way from Ecuador. So I just want at this moment to recognize and give praise to all of our experts, all of our scholars, all the way from Europe, all the way from the Americas, and of course in the different countries of Asia. And these 2 days have been extremely stimulating, and many of the participants are sort of the first time to ARC, and also the first time to Zoom webinar as well. So I think we sort of opened up the dialogue, not only among ourselves, but also to others who are either students or religious or people working in different fields. And so at this time, I would like to sincerely thank everyone for your contribution. And on behalf of the ARC team, I extend the invitation of further collaboration in the future, either in our seminars or in our publications or in other discussions that we may have. We're thinking of in the near future to establish local ARC groups, sort of like ARC Philippines, ARC Thailand, ARC India, ARC Vietnam, etc., in order to have more of a local conversations. And then from those network that we established, the sort of the wider ARC events. And so this is the near future for us. And so we hope to continue to receive your support as well as your wisdom in this effort to continue in research and dialogue. And so at this time, it's already past 10 p.m. in Thailand. So let us just give thanks to God for these days. And then we say a short prayer together. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. Thank you very much, and good night to all. Good morning to you as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our
Thank
participants.
you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Good night.
Thank you to
Thank you, Father.
the
Thank you.
participants in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Europe, in Australia. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to Leo for moderating tonight. Thank you to Ken for doing the technical support. And thank you to all of our experts and all of our participants. So we hope to see you soon in the next ARC event. And also our publication is always happy to receive contributions. And so we look forward to further contributions from you. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Father Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night. Good night.
Thank you, brothers from Sangtam.